This is my first review of a major mainline Final Fantasy release. I see this as a kind of rite of passage, having considered myself a fan since adolescence. With this in mind, I found reviewing Final Fantasy XVI to be a fairly humbling experience. It's an entry unlike anything I expected from this series, and certainly not a title that wholly met the loaded expectations I had for it. Yet, it's a relatively successful experiment. I greatly respect it, and if you are new to Final Fantasy and like a heavy dose of heart-pounding action, this will be a great entry point into the series and is sure to be a fast favourite. Enter old mate Clive, surname Rossfield, the firstborn son of a prominent ducal territory. He's looked over in terms of succession and is considered something of an outcast in his family. The practice of incest was meant to yield him great power, but he didn't get it, at least not initially. What ends up happening is his younger brother ends up with the mantle of dominant. This is a power bestowed upon very few and allows them the abilities of demigods known as Eikons. Ruling nations throughout the world of Valisthea are desperate to ensure they have their own dominant, a kind of nuclear power with which to ensure the status quo between the nations. If it seems like I'm discussing the story in broad, macro-political strokes, that's because I am, and that's just kind of how the story works in this game. It's a fairly standard medieval fantasy, and despite its breadth, it's carried by lightweight yet entertaining writing. All things told, it feels like it's a good entry point for the newcomers ultimately. There is a sprinkling of Final Fantasy-like tropes throughout, revenge quests, magic granting crystals, and monsters and iconography that fans will recognise, but no previous experience is required here. Otherwise, the flavour of this entry is fairly stone-faced and westernised. It's complemented by the best English voice acting to have ever graced this Japanese series, with particular note of Ralph Ineson's Sid being a standout, but there are no bad performances here. Helping keep the player abreast of the many threads through this lengthy saga is a feature known as Active Time Lore. It gives players a bit of a rundown of what's happening at any point in the game, and you can just bring this up whether you're in combat or cutscenes. It's a great context-sensitive way of seeing what's going on in the world, and may be my favourite feature in this game. So the broad yet surface-level storytelling is mirrored in the combat, and that mostly serves to enhance this title's general appeal. Fights occur in real time, and are seamlessly transitioned into while moving about the world. It's kind of like Devil May Cry, or maybe even the recent God of War games. Encounters play out with the appearance of a fast and frantic pace. But you only play as Clive, and you've only got his sword, and this is already a big departure from what we're used to in these games. Instead, you'll have just a basic range of core combos and moves, and a really quite generous dodge that slows down time, giving you a moment to process. If you've never played an action game like this before, then Final Fantasy XVI will initiate you competently and gently, but it will make you look like a combo-wielding badass in the process. Once players are about 6 hours into the game, they unlock their Eikon abilities. These powers, they all deal damage, they look fantastic and can make for some eye-watering fights. But they still keep Clive's combat repertoire feeling pretty fresh. But my biggest criticism here is the early hours of the game are a little bit slow and may leave more experienced players feeling a little bit restrained. If you've any experience with the character action genre, then you may find yourself going through the motions, punching in the same combos over and over again, of which there aren't a great many. However, there's also not a great lot of choice as to how you expand that core combat system. You can't unlock new weapon types, basic attacks, or even extra characters to play with or maneuver. It's about perfecting those fundamentals. It must be noted though that Final Fantasy XVI is a looker. The attention to detail and glorious art direction never cease to amaze me, and the soundtrack is pretty damn good too. The best tunes will be saved for those epic Eikon boss battles you've no doubt seen and heard about, but the B-sides aren't too bad either. It's just not much notable in those quieter moments. On the PlayStation 5 performance side of things, it is worth mentioning that the 30 frame mode is where you want to stay. The graphics mode runs silky smooth. The performance mode, on the other hand, does have a lot of hitches and stuttering, so I would recommend sticking with that graphics mode. Outside of some frame hitches though, this game looks, sounds and performs tremendously well. There's no janky ragdolls, there's no clipping, everything just seems to fit as the developers intended. Now, while it sounds pretty good so far, there is a bit of a contradiction here with regards to the focus of the game. Despite the epic scale of this game, it is quite focused and quite narrow. Throughout the first third of the game, there's going to be a significant stretch of very linear, hallway-like missions that look beautiful. And then in the second half of the game, it particularly opens up into a lot of open zones, which reminded me a lot of Final Fantasy XIV. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy XIV benefits from other players enlivening the experience. Here, it's mostly open spaces with not a whole heap happening, and it can feel a bit lonely. During the second half of the game, I found myself desiring those more linear sections earlier on. They felt more rewarding, I suppose, although there isn't much rewarding in this game. Now, before I forget, the Eikon clashes. This is one of the most impressive parts of the game. Big scale fights between kaiju. If you've seen Godzilla, if you like Evangelion and those big beasties fighting one another, you will be impressed. Clive transforms into a demigod and fights these other demigods with a scale that reminds me of God of War 3, and the team has really nailed that epic feeling, although the gameplay still remains fairly basic during these fights. Final Fantasy XVI is a largely impressive epic fantasy that succeeds in creating a mainline, mass appeal entry into the character action spectacle fighter genre. This game didn't make me want to explore the wider Final Fantasy series, apart from maybe giving 13 another chance because of those linear hallways, but I did feel pretty equipped to take on Bayonetta. Heck, if you've been interested in the grandeur or chaos associated with games like Devil May Cry, onboarding with Clive is the way to go, and if you've always wanted to see what Final Fantasy is all about, then this is the place to start. However, this mass appeal maybe won't appease the rusted-on Final Fantasy fans, but all things considered, maybe this game wasn't made for us either. It's still pretty solid.